Well, I have to say,
Yeah.
after that intro, I was going to say anyway, I have the very, very great honour of being sat up here with Juan Atkins, who I'm the techno editor at Mixmag, and I wouldn't have that job title if it wasn't for this man. So, yeah, it's a pretty big deal, man. Before I go backwards, I wanted to start with something quite recent, which is the other day you picked up the Spirit of Detroit Achievement Awards.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah, you know about that.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And it's handed to people from Detroit who have made an outstanding contribution. How did it feel when you picked up the awards? And
You know, the thing that I can think about was that building is the city council building, is where the Detroit City Council resides, and where you do like you get your marriage license, and you can change your name there, and it's like the municipal city office. And when I started Deep Space Records, which is the first label that I released Cybertron on, I had to go to that building and get my certificate to open my bank account and register with the city. And I never dreamed, I mean, I was like 17 years old in there filling out this form, that 30 years later, I'd be collecting an award in that same building. So that was all I could think about while I was up there making the speech.
And it was you, Derek,
Me,
Jeff Mills,
Derek,
Carl Craig,
yeah,
basically
yeah.
all of the techno fraternity that picked up the awards. Was everybody there? Or was
No. Of course, Derek and Jeff weren't there, but but you know, they still got honored anyway. But you know.
And what was the actual evening itself like? Because I've seen pictures of you guys with your awards and stuff, like having like doing a photo call and stuff like that. Did you celebrate in any way? Was it kind of like or was it quite a sort of formal situation?
Well, that whole week was kind of like a blur because because Movement was coming that weekend, and you know I had a show with Borderland preparing for it. Then we had an after party preparing for it. So all of this stuff was like kind of like segueing into each other. So I actually can't remember what happened after that. But
and how was Movement this year?
it was great. It was great. It's good every year, but. It was really good. We did the Borderland show on the main stage. Kraftwerk played there for the first time. Great. And we were on the stage before them. It was good and bad in a way because, well, they didn't let anybody do visuals before them.
Right. Okay.
So, I didn't know. I wouldn't have signed on for that, but the negotiation was done through Lawrence, which is Mort's nephew. So unbeknown to me, I was spending the day campaigning for visuals that ultimately I got shut down.
That's a shame.
Yeah.
That's a shame. But it's funny again, like you came full circle there by like being on the same stage as Kraftwerk, and they were one of the people that inspired you in the beginning. Yeah,
Definitely. It was a plus for that at least.
Can you tell us, I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with Borderline. It's the project you have with Moritz
It's a
von Oswald.
project that I've done with Moritz von Oswald, and who is from Berlin, and he was the architect behind the Basic Channel and Chain Reaction labels and all of that minimal Berlin from the start, you know. So we've been working together. I'd done my Deep Space album in his studio. He engineered, and so that was kind of the beginning of our collaboration.
And how long have you been working together now then?
Well, you know, we've been working on and off for, what was that, like 95 when I was there doing that record with them. But we even did the 3MB project a couple of years prior to that. Actually, the first time I went to Berlin was to work with him in the studio, work in their studio with Thomas Feldman and Mark Ernestus.
And how did you guys get in touch with each other?
Oh, they came to Detroit in the early days. They were Mark, Thomas, and Moritz came to Detroit, and me and Mike Banks was living in this building on 2030 Grand River, and they come to this building and met us and you know wanted to meet us. And I got a knock on my door one morning. It was Mike knocking, and I opened the door, and it was him and these three German guys. And so they said, yeah, man, they wanted to meet you and everything. So I met them, and they were there like buying old gear from all of the pawn shops, like because people at that time didn't know the value of a synthesizer, of an ARP X, or those kind of early synths. So I guess they would, people needed money and they would go to the pawn shop. So these guys come and buy up all of this gear, and took them back to Berlin and retrofitted with MIDI, so you could MIDI, because this was before MIDI even was implemented, and so they had a way to retrofit these machines with MIDI. So part of my interest to go to the studio was to be able to make use of their I guess invention of MIDI with all of these different manufacturers, because it was like really horrible in the early days, because none of the manufacturers would talk to the other company. Like you couldn't sync a Korg keyboard with a Roland drum machine, until MIDI came along. And but before MIDI, they figured out a way to retrofit these machines with MIDI interfaces. So it allowed us to, like, if you had a Roland drum and you had a Korg or DX7, you could talk to each other.
I guess in a way, like that kind of DIY thinking about the future, like making synths speak to each other, is kind of what techno is about in a way. It's like like creating a language whereby technology can communicate with each other, and you can communicate as a human being with other humans through technology.
Yeah, I mean, it was real tedious in those days, man. Yeah.
Did you spend a lot of time then trying to kind of get your head around that kind of stuff?
I mean, the passion was there, so I mean, I wasn't going to be denied, but it's needless to say, it was. I mean, you can't imagine how many tracks that would have seen the light of day had they been able to be finished, and it was a lot of stuff that, by the time I got the patch cables and got everything to work, I forgot the idea. and so a lot of that stuff was like really from scratch on the fly.
Crazy, man.
Once the stuff got working, then you could finish or you basically had to start a whole new idea.
So what were the kind of key challenges that you faced then in those kind of like pre-MIDI days?
Well, I mean, one of the main things was, if you wanted to record, this was the time before you were able to record your tracks in the digital domain. So you had to record to tape, and one of the main challenges was getting your sequence or your drum machine to sync to the tape, and man, we spent hours sometimes. I mean, sometimes we had to kill a whole recording session because we couldn't get the boxes to sync to the tape. And I can remember coming to England doing a lot of remixes in the early days, man, and like half of the session was just getting the machine to sync to the tape. Wow. Yeah. So that was one of the main issues. Then once you got that going, then you have to figure out, you was always troubleshooting. Because sometimes you would plug something up and it's supposed to work, but you don't hear nothing. So you have to trace back the whole, schematic to see where, why you're not getting sound. And sometimes it'd be just a faulty patch cable, and it's a nightmare, man.
And one of the things that really interests me as a journalist and as a person is the origins and the beginnings and where people come from and people's stories and how things begin. And like one thing about when a genre kind of starts to become a genre of its own is like that transition from it being like maybe an amalgamation of different things and a hybrid of different things, and then all of a sudden techno's here, At what stage did you kind of feel like the music that you were making was a kind of defined genre? Was there a point where you're like, this is definitely like so different to everything else before?
Well, I knew that when I first started.
Yeah.
I mean, I had, a lot of it was experimentation and just, it's like coming up with I don't know if, when you were young, you would go in the kitchen and mix up a whole bunch of different sauces and things and come up with these different concoctions that, that no one would dream of, like you mix ketchup and mustard and hot sauce to make some kind of different sauce, or, it's the same thing. It was the same. We were doing the same thing with instruments, with gear.
A much more complicated process, though.
Yeah.
And tell me, I want to kind of get an idea of. I've never been to Detroit, and I really, really want to go. And like, obviously, being the techno editor at Mixmag, like maybe that's
Right.
a faux pas on my part. Maybe I should definitely have been there. But what I want to get a grasp on is not necessarily what Detroit is like now, but what it was like when you were first starting to produce music. Like, what was the neighborhood like where you grew up, and what was Detroit just on a wider scale like?
If Detroit is the auto industry city. I mean, it's the world headquarters for General Motors, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, and so it's very industrial. And at the height of the industrial age, Detroit was a very big booming place. Mm-hmm. But of course, when technology came and the automation came, the robots replaced workers. And the city kind of became depressed. People started moving out. So it was very, very post-industrial. And this was right during the time at the decline of that, like right at the very bottom almost. And a lot of the sentiment of the city was trying to regroup behind the collapse of the industrial age, and which, since the auto industry was embracing technology, the whole city embraced technology. I mean, and it spread to the arts, to the music, and so the whole idea was to escape this sort of depressed period with optimism of why it was depressed, and which is the transformation into a technological society. So it was just a part of that whole process with the music. It was just a natural thing.
And what was it like where you grew up? Was it heavily affected by this depressed?
Well, the whole city was,
Yeah.
the whole city was like, it was, I mean, hey, we just filed bankruptcy a couple of years ago, right? So, but that to me created a more passion to be creative, and I don't think that this movement would have started in any other city. It was a perfect fertile ground for new technology and ideas, and not just in the industry, but in the arts and the music as well.
Some of the music that inspired you early on was kind of like Kraftwerk, Depeche Mode, Tangerine Dream, people like that.
Yeah.
Was it quite common for young black kids in Detroit to be listening to that kind of music, or was it unusual?
It was common and it was unusual. Yeah. I don't know. It's something about that sound. That Kraftwerk, like when I heard "We Are the Robots," and it just matched what was going on in the city at the time.
Yeah, the automation.
Yeah.
And how did that music filter into your world?
There was a DJ on the radio. See, this was at the time when FM was really young and just started. So when FM came into existence, there was only 3 stations on the FM dial, and it was very loosely formatted. Nobody was paying attention, and so there was this DJ that came on called Electrifying Mojo, and he had no format restriction, because what I mean, they would, these FM stations would like play a whole side of an album, with no interruptions, no commercial interruptions. And so, they were able to do what they wanted to do. And that lended to people being very creative in their programming. And so this was one of the DJs that played, everything across the spectrum. You know, I mean, here's a guy that would play a Peter Frampton record behind George Clinton, you know, and so it was just a crazy mix, but it worked.
And Electrifying Mojo became a very important figure during that era, didn't it?
Yeah, yeah. So that's where I actually first heard the Kraftwerk record. Was on his show, and it just froze me in my tracks because, you know, I was doing music, and I was doing totally electronic, but this was the first time where I heard it like really precise and together, and you know. And I was like, yeah, that's organized. You know, my music was all over the place, but it was very organic and electronic. Everything was electronic, but you know, I didn't know basically how to work with sequencer and things like that at that time. My early demos, everything was played by hand. So even the drum tracks, even the drum kit was made out of sounds, white noise from that machine. Yeah.
And how did you get hold of that machine in the first place?
My grandma bought me this machine. I think it was either it was for my birthday or Christmas or something. My grandma had a Hammond B3 organ, and I used to mess around with this organ. I think I was in like grade school, like second grade, man. I must have been like 7 or 8 years old. And I would come home and I would bang on this organ, and you know, and so I would go with her to a shop called Grinnell's, is where they sold all the organs and pianos, and Grinnell's eventually had this back room where when these new keyboards started coming out, they would have them showcased in this back room. So when she was in the front buying sheet music and getting her organ repaired, I'd be in the little room messing around with this Korg MS-10 or the Mini Mold that were just being introduced for consumer use. And so eventually one day we were in there, and she was in there doing some business, and I think it was the holiday, was either my birthday or Christmas was coming up, so I brung her in the room. I said, Grandma, I really want this machine. And she got it for me. And, you know, the rest is kind of history.
Yeah, thank you, Grandma.
Yes, God rest her soul now. She's passed, but yeah. She's
amazing.
Looking down, so thanks, Grandma.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
And how long was it before you started acquiring other pieces of kit? Did you spend a lot of time with the MS-10 and then decided that you wanted other bits?
Oh, yeah. The second piece of gear I got actually was a Prophet. What was it? It was a Pro 1, what they called it. It was actually a mini version of the Prophet. And both of these machines were monophonic, so you couldn't play chords, and they were not memory capable either. So every time you switched the machine off and switched it back on, it was basically a new sound. And if you didn't record your settings, you know, it was hard to get that same sound back. And so that was another part of the tedious process. Yeah.
And what in those initial stages when you had those first two pieces of kit, what sound were you aiming to create? Were you trying to replicate stuff that was already in existence? Were you just kind of
no, definitely. The whole beauty of the synthesizer was, what I loved about it is because you can make sounds that didn't exist before. So that was my whole thing with it. I was like, hey, you know, why you know, have a synthesizer just to produce something that's already there, you know? And so that was a large part of the drive to create this sound. Yeah.
When did you actually eventually finish a track? Did it take you quite a while?
No. I mean, as soon as I got the synthesizer, man, my first track was done that day. So, you know, so I mean, but I was the only one that was able to listen to it outside grandma and people that kept telling me to turn that shit down. But eventually they came around after, you know, when Mojo played the first record, then they couldn't say nothing else.
Nice, man. How did you manage to get your music to Mojo?
That's another story, long story, actually. Well, not really so much long. Derek May actually was my best friend in high school, and and he moved to Detroit from Belleville before I did, and of course Mojo was like our idol, and so I guess Derek was called himself like my PR guy, and so Mojo used to go to this cafe called Bert's Place down the street from the radio station. Like when his slot was every night from 10 to 3, every weekday, 10 to 3 a.m. And so after he got off, he would sometimes go to this cafe to have a coffee and kind of wind down. And so Derek actually camped out at the cafe because they had this video game called Defender, and which he became an expert at, you know. And so he would steal his mom's car at night and drive down and camp out at this cafe waiting for Mojo to present my music to him. And one day, of course, after he like camped out there for a couple of months, he came in and he met him and he gave Mojo. This was a cassette tape demo, and he gave Mojo the demo. And a couple of days later, Mojo left a message with the cafe owner. He wanted to talk to us. He liked the music and wanted to talk to us. And so we had a meeting with him, and he said, "Yeah, man, if you ever get this out, I would definitely play it." So hey, man, we ran to the pressing plant, like literally out of his office, and got a record pressed up on 45. This was when 45s were still. Anybody knows what a 45 RPM vinyl? Okay. And so we had this record released on a 45 RPM, and we took it down there to him. And it's a crazy story is when we came with the record. Wait a minute, no. I think this was the first meeting when we had I can't remember. It's like 30-something years ago. So, but I think we had a white label. And so we took it and no, it was a cassette still. And so Mojo took us in his office, and this was at a time where he would go through these different musical tangents. Like at this point, he was on a reggae tangent. And so he was in his office, and he had this reggae record playing. And then he put our record on at the same time. This other record was playing. We put the tape on, and he had the record playing, and he put the tape on. And he's got both of these tracks playing at the same time. And he said that if I take the reggae record off, that means I like your record. And so he did this, and we're watching him, and like 5 minutes goes by, and he eventually takes the reggae record off. And we was like, yeah. And so yeah, so when we got the actual label copies done, we gave it to him, and sure enough, two nights after that, he played it. And it was funny, probably one of the best moments of my life. Yeah, actually.
Man, sounds like a really big moment.
Yeah.
And what track was it that he was playing?
Alleys of Your Mind.
Cool.
It was the first Cybertron.
Yeah.
We called ourselves Cybertron and released this record on Deep Space Records, which was the label that I was down at the city council building.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
together.
what was I going to say? So that was a really big moment, and it came through Electrify Mojo, who he became hugely popular, and I think it was you that told a story at ADE last year about him. He had so much power over his listeners that he would be like, right, when I play this track, everyone go out and like turn the light on and off on your porch, and like the whole street would be like lights going on off and off.
Oh yeah, he had a segment of his show that he called the Midnight Funk Association, and every night at midnight, he would have the whole city, like if you're in your bathtub, splash the water. If you turn on your porch light, or if you're in your car, honk your horn and flash your lights, man. And I mean, every night at midnight, man, the whole city would light up, you know. And I mean, and like the station was situated on East Jefferson, which is like one of the major cities that runs parallel to the river. And there was a park at the end of the street called Belle Isle Park. And so people would be going to the park and they listened to Mojo, man, and you couldn't get through the street when he did the Midnight Funk Association, man. The street would literally jam, especially in the summertime. And, he created traffic jams in front of the station, man. It was amazing.
I'm sorry, what's he doing now? Do you know if
I
he's
still
around?
talk to him.
Yeah.
He's still, he wears a suit now and suit and tie, and he's like a businessman, and I think he's doing like real estate and stuff like that now. Yeah. I try to talk him back into radio. I mean, we're doing an internet station called deepspaceradio.com, and I actually tried to get him to do a cameo on our station. I mean, he didn't say no, but he didn't say yes.
You have to keep plugging away.
Yeah.
Does he realize how important?
Oh yes. He's shown up to a couple of events that I played at in Detroit, a couple of major events. So he definitely is aware.
How did you go about setting up the label, Metroplex?
Well, when I graduated from high school, I hadn't had a record out yet, but I had these demos that I was, making with this machine. And so my first year in college, I met Rick Davis, who was the other half of Cybertron. Well, we hadn't started Cybertron at the time, but so I met him, and he had already had a record out that he had pressed himself. And at this time, nobody was aware that you could literally press up your own record. You thought you had to go to a major record company and get a deal. And nobody realized that you could actually, make your own record and sell your own record. But this guy had already had a record out, although it was totally atmospheric electronic music. I mean, there was no beats or nothing on it. But at any rate, he had this record that he had already pressed. So that gave me the initial idea to do this, to create our own label. Well, it was his idea basically, but we created Deep Space Records and did our Alleys of Your Mind. That was like one of the first tracks we did together, and we put it out.
How did you manage to fund it?
Beg, borrow, and steal. No, actually, it didn't cost. I mean, we only pressed up like maybe 100. Like I think we pressed up 500 copies, which cost about $500. And I mean, we chipped in. I mean,
And whereabouts were you distributing them?
Just in Detroit. I mean, it was what you call a local record. I mean, nobody outside of Detroit heard this record until we eventually got picked up by Fantasy Records. Then they took us national. But that wasn't until our second record, which was Cosmic Cars. So basically, it was just a local Detroit. Although it was a smash in Detroit, it was just in Detroit. It kind of filtered out to like other cities, kind of in the Midwest. Like Cleveland was the closest next city to Detroit, like a 3-hour drive. So there was a DJ that was from Detroit that went to a Cleveland, started programming a Cleveland station. So he was aware of the record, and he took it. And so it played a little bit in Cleveland, a little bit in Chicago, but that was about it.
How did the music start filtering into the clubs? And what kind of music were people kind of generally playing and listening to in clubs before techno started to kind of like infiltrate and permeate?
Well,
the
the club scene was kind of on the heels of disco. The disco era kind of started the whole club scene. And a lot of the disco DJs were playing only disco versions, which were 12-inch record singles that were on an album format, basically. And but this record was on a 45. And it was funny because DJs wanted to play this record so bad they would actually take the record and glue it to a 12-inch to be able to play it in the club. So So that's kind of like how it kind of filtered into the club.
Why do you think the record resonated with people to that degree that they would do that? What do you think
It was just a new sound. It was funky. It was different, and it was just people tend to gravitate towards new things, and it was a hot record, man. It was,
Damn right. I wanted to speak a little bit about the scene and the importance of the scene, the TV show, the scene. Like, I don't know if anyone here knows what the scene is, but the scene was like it was a TV show. It was kind of like like Soul Train, where you have like a row of people, but there was like people dancing around. And I've seen footage from that. I've seen like Charivari, and I've seen like No UFOs and stuff. And it's like it looks so incredible. And like if you compare it to like a techno club now, where generally people kind of like in dark clothing, it's a dark environment, and the beat can be quite monotonous, and people aren't really that flamboyant. But when you watch clips of the scene, it's like people like going for it, and like everyone's got their own groove and their own dance. Like, can you tell me a little bit about the scene?
It was a local show, locally produced show. The host Nat Morris and R.J. Watkins, they just they started out at WGPR, which is the radio station where Mojo was. So they were kind of like looking at Mojo, and he, a lot of the records that he would play, they would pick them up and just put them on the show, and it was kind of an extension of what Mojo was doing, but just on a TV dance show, and so they went for it.
Can you remember when one of your tracks was played on there for the first time? Do you have any recollection?
I mean, we watched the show. It didn't have the same effect on me as when Mojo played it. Although it was good to hear, but I can't remember the first time I heard it on there.
Can you recall what the general kind of like fashion was when people were going out to clubs? How would they dress in general? Without being too specific.
Man, I think this was the time. This was post disco. So, I mean, it was like it was still like Swedish knit pants, polyester shirts with the big collar, it was, it was still, it's that 70s kind of disco still, even though it was like 80, 81, it was still kind of a lag over from disco era.
And when did you feel like there was a kind of a scene building around techno? When other people started to sort of like replicate the sound, and it became like the dominant sound in Detroit and in the clubs?
Well, what happened was after, especially my closest friends, Derek, Kevin, Eddie, after they seen all of the accolades that I was getting from this record, it was like, because I was basically a celebrity in Detroit. So I'd be with them, and like, we'd be hanging out, and like, I had all the girls, you know what I'm saying? And so they wanted to have the girls too. So they said, hey man, I got to make a record, So that's basically how the kind of like, the group kind of like just came about,
That's brilliant. Can you tell me a little bit about what the ethos was behind Metroplex? Was there like a general kind of like this is Metroplex, this is what it stands for?
A part of my whole process, and I guess what I didn't talk about was a lot of the development is owed to when I was in high school at Belleville High School. They had a class there called Future Studies. And I took this course because, of course, I was interested in the future and sci-fi, all things sci-fi in the future. And so I took this course, and they had the manual for this course. The reference book was Future Shop by Alvin Toffler. And in this book, he talks about the transition from an industrial society to a technological society, and how that's going to affect, the world as we know it, and social life, and so there's a lot of things that he talked about, and actually one of the things that he talked about is how the cities would grow so large that they would grow into each other and become a metro complex or a metroplex, And so that's kind of like where we got these different words and new terms, and to describe things that didn't exist at the time. That of course you would have to come up with different language and different words and terms to describe these new developments. And so we kind of like just went with that and got right into it, and started to develop our own words to for things that we foresaw coming. And so with just Metroplex is just a short version of Metro Complex, which you have the Dallas Fort Worth Metroplex.
Yeah.
And so that's where that came from.
How about the word techno?
Techno, of course, is short for technology. So it was just simple. Hey, this is technology music. But technology music doesn't really have a good ring to it, so we shortened it to techno. Yeah.
How do you feel about the way that techno has evolved and spread around the globe, and is now actually, according to recent statistics, is the most purchased genre on Beatport? It's quite an impressive stat, considering the amount of crap EDM out there.
Oh man, cool. Beatport owe me some money then, right? Anybody here from Beatport? No. No, it's amazing. I mean, I heard that recently, from somewhere else, and that's definitely amazing. I would have never dreamed that. I mean, I kind of knew that we were, I guess you could say, pushing the cart forward, but I never knew that it would go off the rails. Yeah. And that's basically what's happened.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
You're right. Well, I'm going to stop asking questions and say, anyone out there got a question for Juan? This gentleman over here.
Yep. Hi, Juan. How's it going?
Hi.
I'm just wondering, you didn't touch on, were there any kind of influence, because house and techno kind of grew up around the same time. Were you listening to any of the primitive house music that would have been developing around the same time as you were kind of starting to create your own kind of genre of music?
I got to tell the story about house music in Detroit, right? Oh, okay. Where do I start here? We had a situation which later on, when we do the film and the book and everything, I got to pull something. I can't tell everything right now, but I'll shorten the story to say that we were, and a part of this movement started because we were able to acquire like these 909s when they first came out, and the TR-808s. That's another story I'll tell later. But at any rate, we would take these 909 drum machines and play at parties and use them to play at parties, which Jeff Mills still, that's where he's famous at right now. And so that's where that came from. And so one day it was, everybody had these 909s in Detroit and stuff that we were getting, that's another story. But Derek had to pay his rent, and he didn't have money to pay the rent, so he had to sell his 909. And I said, well, Derek, you can't sell it to anybody in Detroit, especially Jeff Mills, who was in the market for that, because they'll use it against us. So, so he had the idea to take it to Chicago and sell it to Frankie Knuckles. And Frankie Knuckles took that 909, along with him and Chip E, and made that first house record with that 909. And ultimately, it did come back to haunt us because we then became in competition with Chicago. But it was friendly competition. But at least they weren't in our own backyard. And so that's kind of how the movements kind of paralleled each other. It's friendly competition because you had Fraudy Jack Master Funk, that they had the Hot Mix 5 on the radio, whereas in Detroit, we didn't really, after the kind of disco era kind of faded, our mixers went off the air. But they continued in Chicago. And so when, like, No UFOs came out, man, Farty Jack Master Funk, man, played the hell out of that record. And we were selling more records in Chicago, actually, than they were selling themselves, and even in Detroit. So that's kind of how that story went.
What a great story.
First of all, I love that Chicago and Detroit were fighting each other to make house and techno. It's amazing. Sometimes as a musician and an artist, you feel a little bit crazy and you have to get these sounds and these musics out of your head. And then you feel kind of like you're fighting the world. Like, was there a time when you felt like giving up? And if so, like, how did you kind of get through it?
Nah, man, never give up. Never give up. And I know the question is coming at advice that I want to give to young and aspiring producers. Never give up and never be scared to take risks.
That's it. What more do you need?
Probably got time for two very quick questions.
Hi, Juan.
Hi.
How big an influence was P-Funk and like George Clinton on your sound?
What is the question? You
Funkadelic.
said-
How big an influence was that on your sound?
Major. Because that was the music I kind of grew up with. I mean, P-Funk and George Clinton to me was like, I guess, electronic or dance music is to the generation now. It was something about the music that definitely. And I mean, that was the first time that you heard like really funky dance music, 75% electronic, with Bernie Worrell playing like in the bass region with these new synthesizers that were coming, and you can hear a large influence from that in my music even to today. So it was definitely strong, like records like Flashlight and Knee Deep and yeah, man, One Nation Under Groove is one of my all-time favorite records.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. At some point, people would have started coming to as record buyers to Detroit. Like, I have a friend who helps run a record store called Rub-a-Dub in a distribution place, and he used to tell me about him and Martin Mackay's first trip to Detroit and how they kind of met Mike Banks and
Wilbur.
and-
Huh?
Yeah, Wilbur. That's
Okay.
him. Yeah. Wilbur Sanderson. And I wondered about how these encounters generally went and whether you gave preferential treatment to somebody that would come over just based on how, I guess, they would approach you and how much knowledge they had about the music coming to Detroit, where obviously it was, probably quite a different sort of environment from where they were coming from.
Preferential treatment. Wait a minute.
I guess, people would have. I'll give you an example of what I'm alluding to. Wilbur mentioned that when he spoke to Mike at UR, they were like Mike was almost rooting for him because coming from Glasgow, they were coming up against a lot of competition from London, and that resulted in almost like this underdog mentality that Wilbur started to have, and it was something that Mike at least understood and tried to support him in that way. So I wondered if those encounters, how those encounters generally went, and whether they always went well, or whether these were sometimes went wrong.
I don't know. I wasn't really involved so much in that. I kind of was always kind of to myself, and I was very secretive about things. So I really, people kind of felt like I was unapproachable, which I probably was. So I didn't really get too involved in that political area. Does that answer the question? Maybe. Okay.
Do one more. We can very quickly do one more question.
Hi, I saw you before. But, so like obviously you're from Detroit, and like obviously techno started there and everything. Do you feel like with the economy crisis in Detroit that techno music could change that for the city, like, and the crime rates and everything, like, Do you think if they put out more music classes that it could help, you know, the youth and all that and the economy?
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree with that. As a matter of fact, we're about to launch a DJ and electronic music production school called Spin Inc. in Detroit, and we've been talking to the city and different educational people, board of education, to implement our program and for focus towards inner city youth and people that go to prison and coming out of prison. And so yes, I definitely think that if there's more opportunities and avenues provided, that it would kind of decrease a lot of the negative aspects of the city, for sure.
Although I don't want to end this, because I think we're having a really great chat and it's been absolutely wonderfully informative. We're going to close there, but it's a good way to close, because we're speaking about techno facilitating a brighter future for Detroit, and techno is all about the future. So
yeah,
I think that was a good place to end.
For sure.
Juan, thank you very much. Thanks
Thank
everybody
you.
for being here as well.
And thank you very much to Marcus as well. Thank you, Marcus.